Hello, today we have a special guest. He's Gabriel Stein, an independent macroeconomic commentator and forecaster and founder at Stein Brothers Consultancy. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Stein.
It's my pleasure to be here.
When did you come to Mongolia and what are your impressions about our country?
Well, I came here on Friday the 11th, and it's my second time in Mongolia, and that already tells you that my impressions are favorable. Overall, this is a wonderful country. It is a beautiful country. The people are very friendly, and I know you have a lot of problems, not least economic problems, but I certainly hope it's not my last time here.
Mm-hmm. When did you come to Mongolia before?
I was here in October 2018. I was traveling with my brother. We stopped here on the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Could you tell us a little about your visit to Mongolia this time?
Yeah, so my reason for coming here is not a business reason. I am, as you said, an economics forecaster, a macroeconomic commentator, but I'm also interested in history. And I like to visit battlefields, and I wanted to visit the battlefield of Khalkhin in eastern Mongolia, and I'm pleased to say I did. I went with two friends, a gentleman from Singapore and a local Mongolian lady, businesswoman. I'm going to keep saying amazing all the time, but let me just say it was a fantastic trip. We drove 1,000 kilometers east. We saw the battlefield, and I also saw parts of Mongolia that obviously I had not seen before, and it makes me want to see even more of the country.
As a macroeconomic commentator, could you brief us on the situation of the global economy and what's your outlook for the world economy for the rest of 2019 and 2020?
Yes, well, the rest of 2019, we're practically out of it, but it's very interesting. You will find, it seems to me that the common view among many commentators consists of two strands. One is the world economy is headed for a recession. The second is that central banks have run out of ammunition. There's very little they can do about it. I think both of those are wrong. When you look at the data from the largest economies, the euro area admittedly is slowing down. Germany is already in recession, probably Italy as well, not France, but this is enough probably to cause a recession in the euro area. Unlikely to be very deep, but it's there. By contrast, the US economy data is a little bit irregular. There are some things that are slowing, but on the whole, data generally is surprising on the upside. For instance, we just had on 16th October something called the National Association of Home Builders Index. It's a very good forward leading indicator for the housing market. It rose very strongly. Business and consumer confidence is quite healthy. And what is particularly important for me, I am a monetarist economist. It means I look very closely at money, specifically what we call broad money and credit flows within and between countries. US money growth is quite healthy. US credit growth is quite healthy. In fact, what makes me so moderately optimistic about the Eurozone that it will be a short recession is that money and credit growth in the Eurozone is also doing reasonably well. But, so Eurozone in recession, but United States not in a recession, China definitely not in a recession, and other large countries like Canada, Australia, and so on. What we may be seeing is a little bit of a growth slowdown, but leading indicators are already pointing to a pickup by mid-2020. So it's a hiccup, it's not a recession. And as for the other point, central banks have most emphatically not run out of ammunition. The people who say this still believe, for instance, that interest rates can only go to zero and that central banks can only use interest rates. Well, we know interest rates can go negative, and we know central banks can do many other things. So I am short term a little bit pessimistic, but medium term on a 9 to 12 month horizon, I'm already more optimistic about the world, which is good news, I think.
Mongolian parliament is going to discuss interest rate. What would you say about interest rate?
Yes, I understand that there is a move to cap lending interest rates. I think that is an extremely bad idea. I cannot warn strongly enough against it. Let me explain why. Now, first of all, I know interest rates here are quite high. You have inflation of 9%, I believe is the latest number, and yet corporate borrowing, you probably pay 18 or 19%. So it's 10% real interest rates. That is very high, but you ask yourself, why are interest rates so high? And there are a number of reasons. One is the high inflation. One is banks are having capital problems, for instance. But above all, and so I can understand why people don't like to pay high interest rates. But let me explain. Capping interest rates, setting a level above which interest rates may not go, that is like a price freeze. Now, politicians throughout history have tried to stop inflation by imposing a price freeze. It did not work for the Roman Emperor Diocletian 1700 years ago. It has not worked anywhere, anytime. More than 100 countries have tried to have a cap on interest rates. It doesn't work, and the negative effects are enormous, because what happens is, if banks can only lend at one certain type, one interest rate, they will only lend to the best risks. That means that startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, anyone who's deemed a little bit more risky will not get access to credit. There is one second category that will have any access to credit that it wants, even if they're not good risks. These are when you start looking into corruption. People who are friends of the bankers, people who happen to own the bank and who also own a company. So you have, it strangles credit, it increases corruption. Now the companies that cannot get hold of credit will then go to non-bank financial companies, what we call shadow banks. So you will expand the shadow banking system, which, because it is unregulated, means a much higher risk of financial trouble. Plus, of course, they will charge much more. So if, for argument's sake, the interest today is about 19%, and Parliament tomorrow decides that the interest is capped at 10%, you will probably find that if you are an SME or a household going to a shadow banker, let alone a loan shark, you're not paying 20%, you're paying 25, 30, 35%. So from every perspective, apart from politicians trying to gain votes by bribing voters with the voters' own money, this is a really, really bad idea, and it will be extremely bad for your banking system, because it also erodes bank profitability, and if banks are unprofitable, they cannot extend more credit, and if they cannot extend more credit, ultimately the growth of the economy will slow. You can hear that I'm quite passionate about this. It worries me. Every economist will tell you this and will bring up these problems, and politicians don't like to listen. And I sincerely hope that Mongolia does not impose an interest rate cap. Believe me, if it happens, the country will very quickly have cause to regret it.
I would like to ask about FATF.
Yes.
Yeah, grey list. So what is FATF and grey list? What would be the impacts on the economy?
This is deeply worrying. Let me take one step back and explain why. Well, there are two reasons, or many reasons, I suppose. The first one is Mongolia is put on the grey list because there's a problem with money laundering. Now, money laundering is almost everywhere illegal, and whenever anything that is illegal is allowed to flourish, it undermines all respect for the law. And that's bad in itself, regardless of any other consequence. Now, what makes it more difficult in Mongolia is Mongolia runs a current account deficit of, I believe, about 10% of GDP. Now, by itself, a current account deficit is not a problem. It simply means that Mongolia invests more than it saves, and that is exactly how it should be. Mongolia is a developing economy. It's got a young population. Mongolia should get money from the rest of the world and invest it. But and if but the current account deficit does need to be financed. And if Mongolia is, or rather now that Mongolia is on the grey list, the FATF grey list, it means it will be much more difficult to finance the current account deficit. It means that no foreign bank will want to deal with a Mongolian bank. It is too risky, you can be sanctioned, and so on. And that in turn, if you cannot finance the current account deficit, then you have to have one of three things happen. Either you have to save more, which means less consumption, which means slower economic growth, or you have to invest less, which means not only slower economic growth now, but slower economic growth in the future, or you combine them and have either or. Now, admittedly, about half the current account deficit is represented by the budget deficit, and arguably the government could save more, debate and discuss, of course, but it seems to me, therefore, that for Mongolia, an open market economy, reasonably well integrated in the world economy, to be put on the grey list is extremely bad news, because it will impose hardship on the country, and therefore I would urge the Mongolian government and regulatory authorities to implement the different points where Mongolia has been found lacking, and also the extra 5 issues that you mentioned. And I should also say, I know you actually have a good regulatory framework, but it's not enough to have it merely on the books. It actually has to be implemented. The central bank actually has to implement its regulatory, its regulations and so on. And I am sadly aware that there are instances where this is not happening.
How do you see the current state of Mongolian economy? How do you forecast?
Obviously, I'm not an expert on the Mongolian economy, but I am aware that the government and I believe the IMF have lowered their forecasts slightly. I can see why. As I mentioned, there is a slowdown in the world economy, a slight slowdown. There is also the problem that China, which obviously is one of your biggest markets for resources, China is having problems because of the trade war with the United States, and you are, as the Americans so charmingly put it, your collateral damage. You get hurt by, you get indirectly hurt. You will see probably over the next 6 to 12 months somewhat lower commodity prices and lower demand for the commodities that you already sell. That's bad news. I suppose the one thing that might be positive short term is the swine fever in China, since I know that after resources, agriculture is the second biggest Mongolian sector, and within this it's actually livestock. I think livestock is some 97% of agriculture here. So you may find that the Chinese are demanding more Mongolian beef and lamb now that they are running out of pigs, as it were, but that's very short term, and I don't think it will compensate. So there will be a slowdown, but having said that, even with the slowdown, let's face it, your economy is probably growing by 6 or 7%. That's very good. 7%, you double the economy in 10 years, and believe me, in Britain, we would be blissfully happy if we were told that our economy was growing by 6%. So everything is relative, of course. But again, bit of a slowdown, certainly risks on the horizon, notably, as I said, being on the grey list is bad news, and this issue of the lending rate cap. But otherwise, I'm tremendously impressed with what I've seen of Mongolian business. I haven't met terribly many Mongolians, of course, but those I have met impress me enormously with their drive and their dedication and their skills. So I think this is a good country.
In 2014, when the president of China paid an official visit to Mongolia, Mongolia and China presented an objective to increase bilateral trade turnover to $10 billion by 2020.
Okay.
According to a study, over 60% of Mongolia's total trade volume came from its operation with China.
Yeah.
What would be the negative impacts of the US-China trade war on the Mongolian economy? Would you elaborate on this?
Well, as I said, insofar as the trade war leads to a slowdown in Chinese growth, which it is doing, then obviously that in turn leads to a slowdown in demand for inputs, for the resources which China gets, among many other places, from Mongolia. So you're suffering from that. How much? That's difficult for me to say. Obviously, every country, all countries trade primarily with their neighbors, and of course it is an issue that you have only two neighbors, and the two neighbors you have are both of them problematical for different reasons. Again, obviously your trade is at the moment very much dependent on China. So there is no question that this is bad news. Mm-hmm. Much depends how much bad news. We have, of course, recently seen talk of a deal between the United States and China. I worry that although President Trump himself, he probably genuinely wants a deal provided it helps to balance the trade between China and the US, which by the way is totally irrelevant, but that's how he sees it. My worry is rather that there are people around the president who are really not interested in a deal with China. They want to attempt to stop China's rise, and above all, they want to humiliate China and for China to be seen to be humiliated. And while it's true that China is not a democracy, Xi Jinping, by the same token, cannot afford to let himself be seen to be humiliated, and probably also doesn't want to be humiliated. And so there is a danger that American intransigence on one side and Chinese concerns of this on the other side will prolong the period before we get a decent agreement. There are some people who say that the Chinese should simply stall until the US presidential elections next year. That's a bad idea. The Democrats are, if anything, even more hawkish on China than Donald Trump, and that would be worse for Mongolia as well, of course.
Mm-hmm. A Mongolian economy is heavily dependent on mining. We definitely should diversify our economy. Yeah. What should we do to diversify our economy?
Well, that's difficult. I had a very interesting chat in Ulaanbaatar with, I don't want to mention any names, so I will simply say someone who has done a lot of work on regional and sectoral developments of the Mongolian economy. Obviously, your two main sectors are secondary and primary, so the resources and then agriculture. And so it would be easy to say what you want to do next is build up manufacturing. That's probably true, but the question is, can you actually compete in manufacturing, let us say in light manufacturing? Is it possible to compete with the Chinese? I know you have some natural advantages here, but I understand, for instance, that although Mongolia is home to half the world's production of cashmere, a large amount of the cashmere you produce is actually going to China, is then processed there and so on. So there is an issue, and my gut feeling would be that it would probably make sense to concentrate primarily on services, because on services you do have some advantages. You have a well-educated labor force. You have much of the population concentrated in Ulaanbaatar. Mm-hmm. There are things that can be done not only obviously in information technology, although that's the one that everyone thinks is sexy and wants to do, but that certainly would be one sector I would suggest. And I think also there you would compete not only with the Chinese, but you would actually be in global competition where, let's face it, a well-educated but cheap labor force is a major cost advantage, a major competitive advantage. I hesitate to be more detailed than that, because then I will start talking about things that I don't know anything about, and you don't want your listeners to have to listen to that.
Okay. What would you say about the business environment in Mongolia, especially for foreign investors? Of course, we need to attract foreign investment.
It's, again, I mean, the issue there is foreign investors will primarily come for the resources, of course. I know there are some who do not. I should say the one sector where I think, by the way, you do have the possibility to expand, but it will take time. It will take time, a lot of money and a lot of effort. But I think there is an opportunity in tourism to go beyond the adventure tourism, which I know you already have, to mass tourism, basically attracting the wealthy tourists to spend a lot of money, who, let's face it, that's what you want to have, of course, in a country. My impression is that Mongolia is an attractive investment target. There are, as we discussed already, issues with financial regulation and so on not being implemented, but broadly speaking, rule of law here is better than in either China or Russia, for instance. You are nicely centrally located with these two large markets either side. I suppose a drawback is that it is a small population, 3 million, and there are limits to what you can do there. But from what I have seen, it's a reasonably hospitable investment climate, and that's of course good news. And once you're off the grey list again, I think you should be able to find more foreign investment coming back. As long as you are on the grey list, that would be a problem.
Mr. Stein, my last question is about SMEs.
Yeah.
Why? How important are SMEs for the economy? According to this study, there are 80,000 business entities in Mongolia, and 60,000 of them are classified as SMEs. But SMEs are facing many challenges in Mongolia.
Look, in almost every country in the world, certainly in every market economy and definitely in emerging economies, SMEs, and by the way, they are, as you may know, the definition of SME varies from country to country. In Sweden, where I originally come from, I believe at the time a medium-sized company would have less than 200 employees, and a small would have less than 50. In Britain, where I now live, I think a medium-sized has less than 500 employees, and so on. So it varies. But SMEs are the backbone of industry. They always are, because they will almost certainly be more flexible. They will be more nimble. They will create more jobs. And let's face it, all startups are originally SMEs. Apple was an SME once. Facebook was an SME once. Probably the only Mongolian company that I know that probably never was an SME, because I know it was set up even during communist times, is Khan Bank, which was of course Agribank once upon a time, if I'm not wrong. So they were probably always big. But even the big Mongolian companies today, almost all of them will probably have started as SMEs. So this is really important. And governments can improve the situation for SMEs in many ways. One way that if I may go back to that, is, for God's sake, do not implement a cap on lending interest rates. Apart from that, it's very important how the regulatory burden works, how easy is it to deal with authority. For instance, how easy is it to register a company? Can you do it online? Does it take longer than a day? How easy is it to file any information, be it tax or administrative information? How heavy is the burden of regulation, of fulfilling all regulatory demands? All of these things, that is what governments can do can work on to make it easier for SMEs. Now, of course, you also have a problem. Large companies in every country, large companies are the ones that politicians like, because they are household names and they want to please the large companies because large companies are rich and bringing in a lot of money and so on. And that's perfectly true. But there's therefore a danger that large businesses can capture the regulatory bodies. And it's very important to ensure that all issues on business development, regulation and so on, that there is substantial input from SMEs.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stein,
Thank you very
for joining us. It was my pleasure to talk with you.
It was my pleasure as well. Thank you so much.